the group of the so-called new historians. He was one of the first Israeli scholars to look at the Palestinian refugee crisis, which was controversial for an Israeli academic to do that at that time. And more recently, Benny was at the forefront of looking at anti-Semitism and the rise of political Islam and its ideology. And for that, the so-called progressives that we were speaking about earlier in the morning kind of, labeled him as one of these racist, Zionist fascists. But always a scholar that has been pursuing truth, and now he's just finished a work with a colleague on the situation, the history and the current situation of Turkey. So welcome, Benny, back to this program.
Well, for the last few years, the last 7-8 years, I've been working with Professor Dror Ze'evi, also of Ben-Gurion University, on the history of what happened to the Christian communities of Turkey. Today, Turkey's population is 99.8% Muslim. 99.8% Muslim. In the 18th century, 20% of what is today's Turkey's population was 20% was Christian. So how did this 20% vanish? And this is essentially what I'm going to be talking about today. The book, which we researched over the past 7-8 years and wrote, will be coming out next spring, scheduled for next spring. If anybody's interested, it's going to be 600 pages or so, so it's quite long. Between 1894 and 1924, a 30-year period, Turkey's Muslims destroyed the Christian communities of Asia Minor. Asia Minor is Turkey minus today Constantinople or Istanbul. Destroyed the Christian communities of Asia Minor, Eastern Thrace, which is, I don't have a pointer, but it's that province up there which says Edirne. That's the European part of Turkey. And the Urmia district of Persia. The Persian Empire, as you can see in this map from around 1900, there's a lake there at the northwestern corner of Persia, which is today Iran. That lake is called Urmia, and the area to the west of it, all along the lake, was inhabited in large measure by Christians before 1924. All these Christians, Asia Minor itself, which is Turkey, Eastern Thrace, Edirne, and the Urmia area, and we're talking about mainly about Armenians and Greeks, people belonging to the Armenian Church, the Orthodox Church, or Protestants and Catholics among the Armenians later on, Greeks belonging essentially to the Greek Orthodox Church, and Assyrians. Assyrians are a number of different Orthodox Christian denominations. I'll talk about them a bit later. All of these communities, essentially in a staggered campaign over the 30-year period, which consisted of massacres, expulsions, mass rape, and forced conversion. These communities were all destroyed by their Muslim neighbors and by the Muslim state of Turkey. The campaign was orchestrated by 3 successive Turkish regimes. It's not an aberration, a one-time thing, which you might say about, and I'm going to talk about that later, the Holocaust, the killing of the Jews of Europe by the Hitler regime, a sort of an aberration in German history. Here we're talking about 3 successive Turkish regimes and carried out by Turks, Kurds, Circassians, Chechens, and Arab civilians, soldiers, and policemen during this 30-year period. What I'm telling you now emerges from the documentation available in French, British, American, German, and Turkish archives, governmental documentation and missionary documentation. We can talk a little more about the documentation if you like. I'll just add to that. The Turkish archives essentially have been purged or remain closed to researchers. The Prime Minister's Office archive, the main archive of the Ottoman Turkish state, is open, but they purged most of the incriminating documentation, though you can still find documentation. This was done, the looking at that documentation by my colleagues, Dror Zehevi, who's an expert in Turkish, Ottoman Turkish, but essentially this documentation was purged, but there is a supplementary documentation which is still available in these in the main Turkish archive, which corroborates essentially what you find in French, British, German, American archives. There is also a Turkish military archive in Ankara, but that's completely closed to researchers. You can't see anything there essentially. Now, how many people were actually murdered by the Turks, how many Christians were actually murdered by the Turkish government and its auxiliaries is unclear. And the lack of clarity is partly due to lack of definitive numbers about how many Christians there actually were in Turkey, how many Greeks, how many Armenians, how many Assyrians. There's controversy about the number pre-1894 or pre-1914 of these communities. In other words, Turkish records usually give a low estimate of how many Christians existed in the empire in the various provinces. And Christian numbers, Greek numbers, or Armenian numbers usually give inflated numbers for how many Armenians and Greeks lived in the various provinces. So that's the baseline, how many were actually there, and then from that you can somehow compute eventually how many died. But so it remains problematic. Armenians claim that somewhere like there were 2 million Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, mostly concentrated in Turkey. I'll explain where in a second. The Greeks also claim that there were about 2 million Greeks in the Ottoman Empire, most of them again in Asia Minor. And the Turks, of course, talk about 1 million Armenians and something over 1 million Greeks. There were also 600,000 Assyrians. They shouldn't be discounted, the Assyrian minority in Turkey. And the Assyrians essentially belonged to 4 different churches, which were Orthodox churches. The people which are ancient, they come from the 3rd, 4th century essentially. The people who call themselves Assyrians say they're descendants of the people who lived in the Assyrian Empire 3,000 years ago. Somehow around the time of Jesus or just later, they converted to Christianity and belonged to 4 different churches which fight each other. Some of them attach themselves occasionally to the Vatican in some form of affiliation. Some of them aren't connected to the Vatican, but they all are Christians. And there were 600,000 of them originally before 1894 in Turkey. Now, the Armenians claim that 1 to 1.5 million Armenians died in this 30-year period. 1.5 million is more or less the number you'll normally hear. In fact, they claim that most of these 1.5 million, if not the vast majority, died in 1915, 1916 during what is called the Armenian Genocide during World War I, when the Turks systematically deported and killed Armenians. Modern scholars reduce that number to 600,000 to 800,000 in 1915, 1916. In other words, modern scholarship, Armenian as well, says the number was always inflated by Armenian propaganda. The real number is somewhere between 600,000 and 800,000 Armenians were killed by the Turks and their assistants during 1915-16. But we also know that 200,000 were killed in the first bout of massacre by Turks against Armenians, 1894-96. Something like 200,000 died then. And we also know that tens of thousands of others died between 1919 and 1924. So if you add it all up, you end up with probably something like 1.5 million Armenians killed over the 30-year period. Most of them 1915-16, but others before and after. Altogether, we're talking about probably something like somewhere between, there's no way of being accurate here, somewhere between 1 and 1.5 million Armenians died between 1894 and 1924 at Turkish hands, Turkish being Turkey, Turkish policemen, Turkish civilians, Turkish army, and their assistants. Mainly the Kurds, but also with a hand taken by Chechens, Circassians, and later on Arabs. We'll talk about that if you like. The number of Greeks killed is unclear, but it runs into the hundreds of thousands. Greek historians will tell you 1 million Greeks were killed, and they call it the Greek genocide. Nobody seems to have ever heard of it. but among Greeks, they talk about a genocide of Greeks between 1914 and 1924, somewhere parallel in terms of the chronology to what happened to the Armenians. It begins later against the Greeks, but it's sort of parallel from 1914 to 1924. Greek historians talk about 1 million Greeks killed, but I think that there's no way of knowing, but the number sounds inflated, isn't probably inflated, and it certainly runs into hundreds of thousands Greeks murdered by Turks and their assistants between 1914 and 1924. Of the Assyrians, of those 600,000 I spoke of existing in the Ottoman Empire, mostly in Turkey, the Asia Minor, before 1894, approximately 250,000. In other words, 250,000 Assyrians, about half the Assyrian population of Turkey was killed. Almost all the rest were expelled, of the Assyrians, the Greeks, and the Armenians. In other words, those who remained of the Armenians and those who remained of the Greeks and those who remained of the Assyrians after the murders fled or were expelled from Turkey. That's why we, as I say, end up in 1924, only 2% of the Asia Minor population is a Christian, and today, as I said, it's even less. It's a 0.02 or whatever it is, 99.8% Muslim. Now, the thesis of our book, which I think is original, but most people think their thesis is original, is twofold. In one part of it says, scholars have concentrated, Armenians, Turks, and others, not Greeks, but Armenians and Turks especially, have concentrated on 1915, 1916, when the vast bulk of the Armenian dead were actually killed. Speaking of the Armenian genocide, that's the name, most people have concentrated on that, on those 2 years, and disregarded what happened in the years before, and disregarded, in fact, what happened after 1918 to the Armenians themselves. In other words, they focused on one event, but not the 30-year event, which was staggered but occurred over 30 years. Secondly, the historians have essentially ignored what happened to the Greeks and the Syrians. Our thesis is that what actually happened in Turkey was a de-Christianization, not a de-Armenianization, but a de-Christianization, and that was the intent. It wasn't accidental that it's Greeks, Armenians, and Assyrians who were either murdered or expelled. This was the intention of 3 successive Turkish governments. We're talking about the government of Abdul Hamid II, which lasts into the early 1900s. The Sultan is overtaken by a government of young Turks, the Committee of Union and Progress, led by Enver, Talat, especially Talat, Enver, and Jamal. And during the war years, they actually carry out what's called the Armenian Genocide of 1516. And then the third government, which nobody ever mentions, is Ataturk. 1919, 1924, he went about systematically murdering the remaining Armenians in Turkey. That meant those who somehow had been avoided in the genocide because they were doctors, they were lawyers, some of them were soldiers, so they were allowed to remain, them and their families, in the area of Turkey, while almost all were deported and murdered. And also returnees, a certain percentage of those deported and driven out to the deserts, we can talk about that, did manage to come back in 1918, 1919, when the Allies defeated Turkey. Of those who came back, we're talking about 150,000, most were killed in those years, 1919, 1924. So that's the Armenians. With regard to the Greeks, that's essentially when the Turks took care of the Greeks. And that's Ataturk's doing. 1919, 1924, hundreds of thousands of Greeks are murdered, and 1 million plus are exiled, are expelled essentially from Greece, from Turkey. So it's 3 successive regimes in a staggered fashion. It's not continuous, but it's 3 successive regimes are carrying this de-Christianization, carrying it out, and with the result that we know. It includes, incidentally, the massive destruction of property and culture. In other words, Armenian churches, Greek churches, everything to do with Greek and Armenian, and also, by the way, Assyrian culture is destroyed. You go to Turkey today, and I actually went with my colleague, Dror. We traveled up and down Turkey. trying to see what remains in central Turkey, not in Constantinople where some things are preserved, and essentially everything is gone. All the thousands of Greek and Armenian churches, all the thousands of Armenian and Greek villages, and we're talking about thousands, we're not talking about small numbers. Everything is gone, has been flattened. Some churches were turned into mosques, but essentially everything was destroyed during this massive de-Christianization. Now, the Turks hated the Armenians most, and that's why they began to deal with them in 1894-96, and they only later began to deal with the Greeks. The Armenians were seen as uppity. They were rising economically. Many of them held good positions, companies, etc. In Istanbul, in the main cities, in Izmir, called Smyrna at the time. And some of them were urging, especially the middle and upper class Armenians and young educated Armenians were urging Armenian autonomy or more rights. This began in the 1880s, 1890s, the rise of Armenian autonomy parties demanding autonomy for the Armenians or better rights for the Armenians who had been traditionally downtrodden and oppressed by the Ottoman regime and by local officialdom and by local tribes, mainly Kurdish tribes, being harassed, oppressed, overtaxed. People in Armenian villages in the eastern provinces. When I'm talking about the eastern provinces, that's where most Armenians were living at the end of the 19th century. We're talking about the provinces of Sivas, Harput, Erzurum, Bitlis, Van, and Diyarbakir. These 6 provinces in the east, though some people call them the Armenian provinces, they were never majority Armenian provinces, but they had large Armenian minorities. And in them you had Turks and you also had Kurdish tribes who were coming continuously from Persia or from the area of today's Iraq. And they were harassing and essentially taxing the Armenians. Protection, it was called. The Armenian villagers paid taxes to the official government. They paid bribes to local officials, as everybody probably did in the Ottoman Empire. It was based on bribery, the whole empire. In addition, they had to pay protection money to the local Kurdish tribes who oppressed them, who lived next to them and stole their cattle or stole their women or whatever it was, unless they paid protection. And then there were Kurdish tribes who arrived later who asked for tax as well, or additional protection. So you had 3 sets of protection or taxation, whatever you want to call it, tribute, being paid by the Armenians in these 6 provinces in the east, where most of the Armenians, and most incidentally were peasants. We have this idea of Armenians as merchants. There were a lot of Armenian merchants. There was an upper class of Armenians in the main cities, in Istanbul, Izmir, and so on, but most Armenians were simple peasants, except they were religious and they were better educated than Turks because they went to church, they learned their language, they were literate, unlike many of the or most of the Turks at the time. Similar peasants, but not as educated and certainly not as aspirational. The neighbors, their Turkish neighbors, were envious. They were envious and frightened of this demand for autonomy, or reform as it was called at the time by the Armenians, reform of the whole situation so that they would have equal rights. They didn't demand more, though there were parties who demanded autonomy, which you can say is more than what is beyond equal rights. And there were some Armenians, a very small minority, who already started talking about dismembering the Ottoman Empire. In other words, taking away chunks, maybe turning these 6 provinces into a separate state. But this was very rare. This isn't what was normally demanded, neither by the Armenian autonomy parties nor by the majority of Armenians. The Turks viewed what was happening as a threat to the integrity of the Ottoman Empire. They thought the Armenians spoke about autonomy but meant dismemberment, meant independence. And they saw this as a threat to the empire and to their own status as the overlords. Even if they don't get independence, if they get autonomy or get what was called at the time reform, this will threaten the inequality which had existed for hundreds of years before that. In addition, the demand for reform by the Armenians was supported, that is, the Armenians appealed to the powers, especially Russia, which is nearby, and for its own political reasons, it doesn't especially like Armenians at the time, or perhaps today as well, but they appealed to Russia to support them in their demand for reform, equality. Russians, another Orthodox country, sees the Armenians in some way as, their wards, and so the Turks say, you're appealing to the Russians to intervene diplomatically, maybe even militarily, to better the Armenian situation. This also will lead to dismemberment. In other words, not just Armenian autonomy demands, but demanding reform and then being backed by foreign powers who will intervene to support our demands for reform or even autonomy. This will lead to the dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire. So the Turks have two legs on which to stand in the sense of their fears. Their fears may be exaggerated and were, because most Armenians are not rebellious, they're loyal citizens, they may not be happy with the situation, they want reform, but they don't want to break away from an empire in which they've lived for 500 years. But the Turks, I would say, in some form of paranoia, do see them as a sort of an existential threat, the Armenians. So that's why they regard the Armenians among the Christians as the most dangerous, because they have this support from Russia, they have these demands for autonomy, etc. The Greeks don't demand autonomy. The Greeks live, if you look at the map, they live in three areas. The province of Trabzon and Kastamonu, those are areas essentially called the Pontus, or the Pontic Greeks, and they live along the Ionian coast, along the Aegean coast, Aegean province, with the center in Izmir. And those are the two main clusters, that is this coast and that coast. These, of course, Greeks are descendants of the Greek settlers, colonizers, 3,000 years ago. In other words, they arrived there at the time of Homer or before Homer, many long years, hundreds of centuries, many centuries before Turks ever arrived. So they regard themselves as the natural inhabitants of the land. The Turks are usurpers who've somehow taken over Turkey. But those are the Greeks there. Now, the Greeks don't have a national movement. The Greeks have a country across the sea called Greece. There's a kingdom of Greece. Greece had been occupied by Turkey for hundreds of years. In the 1820s, it rebelled against Turkish domination. And from that point on, the Greeks in Greece would like to expand. They want to expand their hold to encompass the Greek communities living also in Turkey, a greater Greece, if you like. They would like to construct. It's called the Big Idea. And many Greek politicians in the early part of the 20th century support this idea of Greek expansion. But the Greeks in Turkey don't back, or don't necessarily back, this enosis, so this unity of all the Greek peoples and the expansion of Greece to include parts of Turkey. They're essentially quite dormant nationalistically. The Greeks from Greece itself send clergymen, send educators, send pamphlets to the communities in Turkey, trying to raise their national consciousness. Many of the Greeks, incidentally, in Turkey don't even speak Greek. They do belong to the Greek church, but they speak Turkish. They don't remember Greek. They don't speak Greek, but slowly the Greeks in Greece try to help them to expand or to develop a national ethos and a desire to unite with Greece itself in this megala idea, as it's called, which is the greater Greece, but it doesn't happen. There is no Greek rebellion in Turkey before 1914, or there's even after. It doesn't happen. There's no Greek rebellion in Turkey to support the idea of unity with Greece or joining the Greeks. Though after the Greek army invades Turkey in 1919, there is some recruitment of local Greeks into the Greek army which has invaded Turkey. But we'll talk about that later. This happens from 1919, which in a sense triggers Ataturk's expulsion and destruction of the Greek communities. I said the Armenians were seen as the greater threat, and that's why the government unleashes the massacres of 1894 and 96 against the Armenian communities in Greece. they're demanding reform. As I say, foreign powers sort of intercede, at least diplomatically. They never actually come to the aid of the Armenians, but they intercede diplomatically, and this annoys and even frightens the Ottoman authorities. In 1894-96, they unleash a series of massacres, and we're talking about giant massacres. We're talking about 100,000 people actually butchered, and I mean butchered, axes, knives, stones, really the worst type of scenes you can imagine. And that, in addition to the 100,000 killed during those 3 years, probably another 100,000 to 200,000 Armenians, 1896-97, die as a result of the massacres. What happens in a massacre is they kill usually the menfolk. The Turks kill the menfolk. They kill some women and children, but usually the menfolk, the breadwinners. They destroy the homes or take over, confiscate the homes of those massacred, and then you end up with women and children in the street without shelter, and the weather in Turkey is quite difficult. It's very hot or very cold. So they end up in the streets begging, and another 100,000, maybe as many as 200,000, die as a result of the massacres, which kill off 100,000 to begin with. So we're talking large numbers, and this is unleashed against the Armenians by the Turkish government in 1894-96. 1915-16, against the backdrop of World War I, we have the giant deportations. The Turks say they're deporting people or communities, Armenians from the east especially, but also from other places, which the explanation doesn't really pertain to. But from the east, they're deporting the populations to keep them away from the war zones in which the Russians and Turks are busy fighting along the Caucasus. So it's a security measure. That's the way the Turks describe the deportations. But as I say, the deportations occur across all of Turkey, not just eastern Turkey. So this doesn't really explain what happened. And the deportations are employed as a way of killing. It's not just moving people, it's actually used as a method of killing. That is, the deportees end up walking hundreds or thousands of kilometers in the heat, or especially in the heat, because most of it occurs spring, summer, autumn of 1915. And most of the deportees die on the road. That's usually after the menfolk from each village have been murdered initially. That is, before the deportees are sent off, women, children, and old people, the menfolk, the adult males, are killed. So only something like 20-30% of the deportees do actually reach the eastern deserts, the area of Deir ez-Zor, which we see often in the news nowadays, some Aleppo and Mosul. But those are the areas to which they deport the Armenians southwards in the great deportations of 15-16. The Turks turn against the Greeks, but not as viciously and not as systematically in 1914. In the first half of 1914, that is before World War I is declared or begins in August 1914, between January and June 1914, there's a systematic clandestine Turkish campaign against the Greeks living especially in the Aydin province, the Izmir area along the coast. The Turks can describe this as, well, firstly, they deny it's happening, but secondly, they can describe the campaign as preventive, because maybe there'll be a Greek-Turkish war, and these people along the coast might help Greek invaders. So that's the sort of explanation of what's happening. The campaign is essentially an economic boycott against the local Greek communities along the coast, accompanied by murders here and there. In other words, there's a continuous murder of people, Greek farmers in the fields, Greek merchants, and there's a boycott of Greek produce, Greek personnel, etc. And this leads to a mass emigration of Greeks. Maybe 100 to 200,000 Greeks leave before World War I. They leave Turkey, especially from this coast, though there are also boycotts in the Pontic area along the Black Sea of Greeks as well. During the World War, which begins in the summer of 1914, the Turks argue Greek populations along both coasts, the Black Sea, which can be reached from Russia, and the Ionian coast, which can be reached by French and British fleets. The Greek populations along these coasts represent a potential security danger to the Turkish coastline, to the Turkish army and so on, and they begin to deport people inland. What does deportation mean? It's very rough, there's killing also, but it's not done as roughly, if you like, as the deportations of the Armenians. It leads to thousands, maybe tens of thousands of deaths. And the Greeks are basically deported to inland, to villages, usually Muslim villages. So you have 50 Greeks deported from a certain place, and they're planted in a Muslim village where the Muslim population doesn't want them. They have no houses, they have no jobs, they have no lands. So some of them die off also, famine, disease, and so on. So the deportations during World War I are mostly inland. They're not as brutal, I think, partly because the Turks fear that the Greek state will come to the Greeks' aid. Greece stays out of the war until June 1917. The British want the Greeks to join the Allies in the war. The Greeks don't want to join the war, the Greek state, and stay out of the war until June 1917. So the Turks have to be careful not to be too brutal towards their own Greek population, because it may lead Athens to declare war and to join the Allies. So that's probably one explanation of why their treatment of the Greeks during World War I is not as severe as what happens to the Armenians. In 1919, in May 1919, after Turkey has lost the war and been defeated and partly occupied, but not properly occupied by Allied forces, there are Allied troops in Constantinople, there's Allied troops in some of the southern provinces, along the railroad lines, along the coast, the Pontic coast. There are some Allied occupation troops, British, Indian, belonging to the British Army. The French occupy one or two areas in the south as well. There's even Italian troops in Antalya and the Aydin province. But what most annoys or the Turkish population is the Greek landing in Izmir, in Smyrna, in May 1919. This invasion by the Greek army, which takes over the city and then spreads inland, is seen as a humiliating. Greece used to be a Turkish province. Suddenly the Greeks are invading Turkey. They can't stand this, and they begin a guerrilla war against the Greek invaders, who, as I say, push inland and almost reach Ankara. This leads eventually to within months, not very long, it leads to the emergence of a Turkish nationalist movement. This invasion by the Greeks and the continuing occupation of British, French, and Italian troops in various parts of Turkey, it leads to the emergence of a nationalist movement under a man called Mustafa Kemal, eventually called Ataturk, and they begin a guerrilla campaign against the Greeks. Later they begin a guerrilla campaign against the French. They don't actually touch the British, they're a bit afraid of the British, but they do mount guerrilla war against the Greeks and the French. And while mounting this war, they drive out the local Greek populations from the areas under nationalist Turkish control. That is, they essentially use this war as an excuse or as a good reason to drive out the Greeks, who are of course described as potential supporters of the Greek army, a potential fifth column in the midst of the Turkish lands. And the same applies in the French areas, which are in Kilikia, essentially, the areas the French control from 1919 on, the Adana province, Marash, Aleppo, the northern part of the Aleppo province, which is part of Turkey today. They mount these two guerrilla wars against these two foreign invaders. And there in the south, in the Kilikia, Adana, northern Aleppo area, they essentially uproot the local Armenian communities, which, as I say, remained in those areas either as during the deportations or were reinvested by Armenians who'd come back from the expulsions, deportations to Mosul, Deir ez-Zor, had returned to Ain Tab, to Adana, to Mersin, and so on. They uproot these as well during 1919, 1923. The Greeks, essentially, the Greek populations along the coasts, as during the World War, were initially uprooted inland. That is, sent into the interior, away from their towns and villages, to fare as best they could. That happens until 1921. In 1922, the Turks changed the direction of the deportations and began to deport people from the interior, Greeks, who had been moved into the interior or had lived already in the interior, or moved towards the coast and then put on boats and sent to Greece. And that's why by the end of 1923, something like 1.2 million Greeks had been expelled to Greece. At the end of this period, during 1923, the Allies and the Turks reached a peace agreement called the Lausanne Agreement. Separately, the Turks and the Greeks negotiate what is called a population exchange agreement. And this ends up during the years from October 1923 until about 1926 in an exchange of about 140,000 remaining Greeks in Turkey, moving to Greece, and about 300,000 Muslims who lived in the Turkish areas, in the Greek areas in Thrace and so on, Crete, moving from the Greek areas back to Turkey, or into Turkey, not back, but into Turkey. They're not really Turks, but they are Muslims, and they move. So there's an exchange of 300,000 Muslims and 140,000 Greeks in this, as a result of this exchange of population agreement. But you'll find often in history books today that it describes what happened between the Greeks and Turks from 1919 onwards as an exchange of population. Greeks moved this way, Turks moved that way. What actually happened was a massive expulsion and murder of Greeks from 1919 until 1923, and then the remaining Greeks were exchanged, the 140,000 were exchanged for Muslims through this exchange agreement. But this wasn't, the whole thing wasn't an exchange, it was a massive expulsion followed by a small exchange of population agreement. But some people call the whole thing which happened, everything which happened vis-a-vis the Greeks and Turks, 1919, 1923, a population exchange. It's incorrect. It's a propagandistic and incorrect description of what happened. Now, in 1894-96, when Abdul Hamid unleashed the first series of massacres against the Armenians, which led to, as I say, somewhere between 100 and 300,000 deaths, he wasn't thinking genocide. He was thinking punishment. He was thinking deterrence of Armenian uppityness, Armenian demands for reform, Armenian autonomy, maybe even Armenian independence. He wasn't thinking genocide. That's fairly clear from what we have. Though, as I say, the Ottoman archives are closed on this point. You don't find material about this. But that's apparently what was governing him. But I think he did think of also getting the Armenians out. They didn't want the Armenians there. So it's a sort of a mixture, but it wasn't genocidal. But it did pave the way psychologically and in terms of preparation of the population of Turkey for what they did in 1915-16, which was systematic murder, amounting to 600,000 to 800,000 people just murdered. It prepared everybody for what was happening. It dehumanized the Armenians. They were described often in terms, incidentally, you'll find in the Holocaust, Germans vis-a-vis Jews, as germs, as cancer, and the various terms which dehumanize were used against the Armenians as well. And so the Turkish population by 1914-15, you can kill Armenians. That's you know, and you can carry out mass murder. And so it was very important, that first stage, 1894-96, in what happened 20 years later. It also prepared the Armenians in a sense. It sort of, they understood that they're victims, they behaved like victims, they didn't really resist because they knew their neighbors were murderous and would kill them if they resisted. So it prepared them in some way psychologically also for what happened. And what happened is, well, all mass murder is appalling. In our book, there will be a phrase which some people will find difficult to stomach, especially Turks. But when it came to the actual murder of Armenians by Turks, and as I say, much of it was done by civilians, not by soldiers or policemen, we find much more sadism and brutality, there's no other way of describing it, than you find in the Holocaust. In Germany, that is the Germans killing Jews mostly in Poland and elsewhere, it's done systematically, it's done industrially. It's not a matter of each soldier being a sadist and going around killing people. He's told to kill and he kills. It's of course obviously objectionable, but here you find populations being egged on by their women to actually axe and hatchet and stab and pillage and burn people, and just horrendous. The picture of what happens in 1894-96, and the same applies to 1919-1924 in the Turkish behavior towards the remaining Armenians and the Greeks. Now, why do the Turks undertake this de-Christianization? And this is really the big question. I mean, the facts about what happened, I think I've basically told you. They can be spun in a number of different ways, but essentially I've given you the picture of what happened. But why does this happen? That's a crucial question which historians have faced, and there are good histories, incidentally, of some of this, of 1915-16 by Turkish scholars. Taner Akçem has written good books about what happened to the Armenians in 1915-16. Kevorkian, an Armenian scholar, has written a good history called the Armenian Genocide. But there's arguments about why exactly it happens. Well, there is a real Turkish fear of dismemberment. There is a Turkish fear by the upper class, by the hierarchy, by the government, by the people who run the government, that Turkey is being threatened with dismemberment as a result of the Armenian. It's not rebelliousness, but it's uppityness. It's the demands, as I say, for reform, for equalization of rights. And there's a bit of Armenian terrorism, and there's the fear of Russian intervention. All of this is real. This all follows, and this you must understand if you are to understand why the Turks think and feel the way they do. This all follows. 1915-16 follows continuous Turkish losses, Ottoman losses of territory in previous wars against Christian powers. There's a rebellion in Greece, well, that begins in 1830, 1820, but in Crete, they lose Cyprus, they lose Libya to Italian intervention, they lose great areas of the Balkans, which they had owned. What remains eventually is Edirne province, but they owned much of the Balkans, and this is lost in the Balkan Wars of 1912, 1913, to Christian powers, to Serbs, to Russians, and so on. So there is there's a real fear of what the Armenians are doing. As I say, it's paranoid to some extent, but they don't want to lose more of their territory. There's also vengefulness, which is important. The Armenians are paying the price for what Christians elsewhere did to Muslims in Saloniki and various other areas, which the Christian powers or Christian rebels had taken from the Ottomans during the previous century or the early years of the 20th century. Armenians pay, in a sense, a price in terms of revenge. What they did to us there, we'll do to them here. There's a second thing which is called Islam, and Islam is a major component, a major cause of what happens in the massacre of Greeks, Armenians, and the Syrians. There is an obligation in Islam, in the texts of Islam, in the Quran itself, to fight infidels, to fight non-Muslims. It's called usually jihad. You can talk about it as being defensive or offensive, but jihad is an important concept stemming from the basic texts of Islam and the basic pillars of Islam. And in addition to that, there's a sense that the Christian is inferior, the infidel is inferior to the Muslim. And threatening to the Muslim. And this is part of the history of Islam versus the Christian West. The missionaries, and there's a large web of American missionaries in Turkey during the 19th century. They spread out in the 19th century, the early 20th century, and the missionaries are seen, the American missionaries, Protestants mostly, but there are some French and German also, and British. They're seen as a subversive element implanting among the Armenians, and to some extent among the Greeks, but mostly among the Armenians, a sense of equality, a maybe even rebelliousness. And there's also a desire to Islamize the Christian population, again, stemming in part from Islamic beliefs. This is certainly true about Abdul Hamid, and it's also true about 1914-18. One of the interesting things you find also up to 1923, alongside the murders and alongside the deportations, you also have quite often Muslim officials, Turkish officials, telling the population which is about to be deported or murdered, in fact, you have the option of converting to Islam, and thousands, maybe tens of thousands of Armenians actually do it. Whether they do it sincerely, they don't do it sincerely, whether the Turkish authorities even regard the whole thing as serious. At some points, Turkish officials like Talat tell their local officials, the valis and the mutasarrifs, don't accept conversion, it's not sincere. Abdul Hamid does the same in the earlier bouts, but each of these bouts of massacres accompanied by mass conversion of Armenians, and that's why, incidentally, Turkey's population today contains lots of Armenians and their descendants. They don't call themselves Armenians. Often they don't know they're Armenians or of Armenian descent, but they're actually of Armenian blood. And you do find now among Turks this desire to know who their grandparents were, and sort of even some sort of return to Christianity among these sort of Moranos, or whatever you want to call them. There is a rise of nationalism. Alongside the rise of Armenian nationalism and some form of Greek nationalism among the Greek minority, there's also Turkish nationalism. During the Ottoman period, there isn't nationalism. The idea of the Ottoman Empire is a multicultural empire run by Turkish Muslims, but with lots of different cultures. And you give protection and certain rights to your Christian minorities, and you protect them. But at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, against the backdrop of the wars in which nationalism figures large, by Greeks, by Serbs, by Bulgarians, you name it, there is a rise of Turkish nationalism, sort of to counter this nationalism, and that also is one of the factors, that is to turn Turkey into a Turkish country. That's the idea of the nationalists, and this is true about the CUP, that is the Young Turks, and certainly about Ataturk. He wants to make Turkey a modern nation state and homogeneously Turkish, without its minorities of Greek speakers, Greek believers, Armenian speakers, Armenian believers, and so on. He wants Turkey for the Turks. That's one of the motivating forces. In other words, you've got Islam, you've got nationalism, and you've got this sort of sense of the Christian as a threat. There's a racial explanation, and that was quite prevalent, and you find it in documents. That is, the Turk is inherently the terrible Turk. That's the phrase coined by Gladstone during Turkish massacres of Bulgarians a few years before, the 1870s. The Turk is naturally evil, the Turk is naturally barbaric. This explains their behavior. This is what motivates them. This would be discounted, is discounted, I suppose, in most studies of what happened. This doesn't explain it, but there is a lot of Turkish butchery which needs explanation. That is why it's so deep, this violence once it starts. There's a large economic aspect to what happens, and the economic aspect is dual. There's great financial gain in each of the bouts of violence from expropriation of Christian property, both on the individual level, that is, the neighbors steal the guy's house or the furniture from the house of the people he just murdered, and by the state plundering the factories, the banks, whatever is owned by Christians. So that's an important element as well. Revenge I mentioned already, and I think sexual gratification is also important in what happens in the localities. Some people say, incidentally, it's centrally directed and orchestrated. In other words, Istanbul, Constantinople, the government tells the local officials and tells the generals, your people can actually rape as many Armenian women as you can, in order to turn them into Muslims. Once they produce children and the new husband is a Muslim, it reduces the number of Christians, expands the number of Muslims. That's one explanation. But there is the simpler explanation of people wanting to rape their neighbors. And this happens in enormous quantities. That is, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of rapes in these 3 bouts of massacre. It's accompanied by every report by every diplomat, and the place is covered in diplomats, especially up to 1915. American, British, German, French, they're all over. Britain has 27 consulates in Turkey itself during the period before they go to war in 1915 against Turkey, and they all report enormous numbers of rapes every year. It's all systematic, it's never punished. It's something which apparently is encouraged by the state. One last sentence, since I have 1 minute left. I'll talk about the Jews. There is a very small Jewish minority in Turkey. It's very small and insignificant. And for that reason, or maybe that's one of the explanations, these bouts of massacre never encompass the Jews. There's no order ever to kill Jews. No Jews are killed. It's not part of what is going on. It's de-Christianization. Leaving aside the Jewish minority because it's very small, insignificant, unprotected. They can't bother anybody in any way. The only way that Jews appear in the documentation during these bouts of massacre is occasionally the Turks use them to cart away the bodies. They send them, instead of Muslims, to gather the bodies from places where there have been massacres, in towns I'm talking about, and cart them away. Okay, I'll leave it at that since I don't have time. I wanted to talk about comparisons between the Holocaust and what happens here during the various bouts of mass murder, but I can leave it open for questions if anybody's interested in that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So Benny, thank you. Can somebody turn off the projector?
Green button.
Just hit it.
Yeah. Green button. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks. Okay, so Ira, it's Q&A now for about half an hour. So Ira.
Yeah, I'm Professor Morris. I'm not trying to defend Turks, but I just read in the Vanquish about the Greek invasion. There was a fair amount of Turk, at least in this description, Greek massacre both by the army and local Greeks of Turks as the Greek army began advancing.
May 1919. Yeah.
Is that from?
It's correct. There are massacres by Greeks after the invasion. You can say they're revenge massacres because during the previous 4 or 5 years, Turks had been massacring Greeks in much larger numbers. But there were hundreds of Turks massacred by the Greek army as it invades. Maybe 1,000, maybe 2,000 Turks are killed. There's various investigations at the time by impartial bodies of what happened. But this is correct. And there's also during the 3 years which the war continues between Greeks and Turks, there are occasional massacres by Greeks. The difference really is it's not policy. It happens on the local level, local officers, soldiers taking revenge or killing villagers and so on. It's not official policy, and people are punished in the Greek army for doing that. This never happens in the Turkish army.
And what about Western Thrace? Was there
Western Thrace?
Were there killings besides deportations by Greeks and Turks in Thessalonica, etc.?
Well, it depends what period you're talking about. Are we talking about 1919, 1923?
Yeah, well, that and 1912 and 1914.
Well, I don't know the Balkan Wars. I've never studied the Balkan Wars. I'm sure there were mutual massacres during the Balkan Wars in 1912, 1913. During 1919, 1923, there was displacement of Turks from Western Thrace. I don't think it was accompanied by massacres. There were official British officers looking over what was happening. They don't report massacres.
Thank you very much. Just 2 short questions. How do you read the silence of the French, of the British, for instance? Because probably they were more focused on Sykes-Picot 16, or because they were more focused on the other front, just focus on the role of T.U. Lawrence. How do you justify their silence?
No, there isn't silence. This isn't an accurate portrait. The word silence isn't right. There's non-intervention. In other words, why don't the British and French fleets go into the ports and threaten Istanbul or whatever when they hear about the massacre of 100,000 Armenians, say in 1894-96? They don't intervene, but they do.
It's the soundtrack.
Yeah. There is diplomatic intercession continuously. The diplomats, the ambassadors go to the Sublime Porte, they go to the Sultan, they say, we have reports from our consuls, the Turks are busy massacring especially Armenians, and the Sultan says this is untrue. And then they come back to him and say, but our people are reporting this, and it's happening on the ground, and he says it's untrue, I'll check. And that's how it ends usually. Nobody intervenes, that's the point, militarily, and there's no economic damage. There are economic interests for that. This is true about the British, and it's true about the Russians and the Germans, to whom they also, Armenians, appeal. They don't intervene in that sense. The French are playing a much more dubious game throughout. The French, especially during World War I, and especially during the period after World War I, the French seem to be very reluctant to take on the Turks, to fight the Turks, and even when they're occupying and fighting Turks, there's other Frenchmen who are busy selling arms to Turkey. During the Franco-Turkish War, 1919, 1921, you've got the French, essentially the French government, supplying arms to the nationalists who are fighting their own soldiers. French diplomats assuring the Turks, yes, we will stop, we will leave Turkey if we just receive economic concessions from you in the peace which we agree to. So their economic interests are sort of, the British morality plays a role in it. The Americans are more complicated. If you like, I'll go into it. There's the American ambassador in Turkey, 1919, 1927, Rear Admiral Bristol, is a pro-Turk. He hates the Armenians, hates the Greeks, sends back dispatches always highlighting Christian atrocities, some of which are real, some are not real, and downplaying Turkish atrocities or dismissing them completely, and looking after American economic interests. That's what interests Bristol. We must behave nicely to the Turks because that will assure our post-war economic interests in Turkey.
Thank you.
Actually, the comparison between Holocaust and Armenian genocide was the issue that I was waiting to listen for. So maybe a couple of words. And the main question, why doesn't Israel want to acknowledge Armenian genocide the same as over here?
Well, that's simple. Israel believes it's a national interest, not Israel. The Israeli leadership believes it's national interest, and they've believed that for the last 50 years. Is good relations with Turkey, and these will not happen if they buy into the genocide, Armenian genocide, even though it's contrary to truth and contrary to morality. That's Israeli government policy. The Holocaust, it's a bit complicated, but there are lots of grounds of comparison between what happened in both cases, 1940, 1945, 1914, 15, 1923. Firstly, it's interesting to note that the fog of war, the war as the background, is used and is very useful in committing genocide. The Germans exploit it to commit the genocide against the Jews. The Turks essentially do the same in relation to the Armenians, at least during 1516. The fog of war. And it's good in a number of ways. Firstly, there's fog, which means people don't know what's going on. The Armenians don't know what's going on. The Allied powers don't know. It takes time for news to filter out. It's not believed, and so on. The same applies in both cases. Also, what happens in wars, people become vicious. All wars brutalize. If the background is a war, you will take nasty measures against the enemy and those perceived as fifth columnists supporting the enemy. That's normal. And that's what happened with the Holocaust with Russian prisoners of war, and so on. And the same applies to Armenians both genocides are state-organized. They're not spontaneous. Even though you've got a lot of spontaneity, at least in the Turkish-Armenian, Turkish-Greek side, you've got spontaneity on the local level, villagers simply killing other fellow villagers, but it's always with state consent, essentially. It's state-organized, even though the Turks still deny the whole thing is state-organized, even though they say there were some massacres, but it wasn't us, it was locals being nasty. What's interesting, an interesting difference is in Turkey, much of the murder is done by civilians. And in Germany, that is the case of the Holocaust, it's the German army, the SS, the Einsatzgruppen, the police forces, the order police, and so on. But it's not civilians killing Jews, essentially. I mean, there may be some Ukrainians and Poles killing Jews, but it's not German civilians killing Jews. That almost doesn't happen in the Holocaust. That's a major part of what happens in Turkey. Both sides, both the Germans and the Turks, use auxiliary peoples to carry out murder. The Germans use Ukrainians, White Russians, Poles, and all sorts of others to do some of the killing or some of the roundups, Vichy, police forces, and so on. In Turkey, they use Kurdish tribesmen, Kurdish Hamidiya battalions, sort of regular troops. They use Chechens brought in from the Caucasus. They use Arabs in some cases, Bedouins, especially in, well, the map's down, but the Deir ez-Zor area, when the deportees reach the Deir ez-Zor area, many of them, some of them are raped by Arabs, many are murdered by Arabs there as well, by Bedouins used by the Turks. This is something which also doesn't appear, and it's not that large, but it happens. So you have this use of auxiliaries in both cases. You have a special organization used in both cases. The Germans initially have the Einsatzgruppen and the special murder squads, which are used in areas being invaded in Russia by the German army, and behind they start killing Jews. They use special forces for that. The Turks organize something called the Special Organization. You won't find, incidentally, one of the reasons we know that the Turkish archives are being purged is this special organization is not mentioned in any Turkish document, but everybody knows it exists. In memoirs and so on, we belong to it, or we ran it, or we saw people from there. It's there, and they, or in some areas, organize murders, mass murder I'm talking about, of Armenians, especially in the east. This use of deception is important in both mass murders. The Germans tell the Jews, you're being transported eastward for resettlement. And the Turks tell the Armenians, as they set out in the deportation columns, you're being resettled in the east, or the southeast, actually. And this, people like to believe that they're going to live. They don't want to know they're going to certain death. So this works in favor of the killing. There's a sheep going to the slaughter in both cases. In other words, from the victim's side, there's almost no resistance in the terms of the Armenians vis-a-vis the Turks, in terms of the Jews vis-a-vis the Germans. The Armenians have some arms, unlike the Jews in Germany or Poland or whatever, and there are some cases of rebellion by Jews. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in Treblinka, we know there are some rebellions against the Holocaust, and in the Armenian case there are some rebellions also. In Zeytun, in Van, Musadag, there's a famous book called The 40 Days of Musadag, written incidentally by a Czech Jew, Franz Werfel, which is the best novel, in fact, of describing the Armenian genocide of 1516. So there was resistance, but it's rare. There's almost no resistance. Again, partly because of the deception, because they think they're not going to die. They think they're going to be resettled somewhere. In the Jewish case, incidentally, you've also got the Judenrats. And in the towns, you've got local Jewish committees, which in some way help the Germans organize what happens afterwards, to keep the Jews quiet and to organize things, to give lists of people who are about to be deported, sent east. In the Armenian case, there is no Armenian cooperation in the genocide. It's different. There's no Judenrats of Armenians cooperating with the Germans. That doesn't happen. With the Turks. Doesn't happen. The last thing I'll mention, which is common, there are death marches that is people being taken on death marches, but this happens in the Holocaust happens when camps are being evacuated in the east. People are being marched somewhat towards their death, towards Germany, when the Germans evacuate the eastern areas, Poland and so on. In the case of the Turks and the Armenians, the deportations, the marches, are the means of death. Here it wasn't the means of actually killing people, just moving, emptying the camps and moving people. There it's actually a way of killing people. Even though you can say to Western diplomats, no, we don't intend to kill them, we're just deporting them away from war zones. That's the explanation.
So, for me, an interesting and compelling case, I don't know if that was the aim of it, the idea of this de-Christianization as a sort of a cleansing animated by Islam, you said nationalism, loss of lands, making a very easy kind of comparison to the Holocaust. My question, though, is if we zoom out and ask in the universities, you see a move towards comparative genocide studies. I wanted to ask you if you believe that is a good way as a historian to study these atrocities in history, let's say, or do you think that they should be studied on their own?
I don't know. I haven't got an answer to that. In some ways, using it comparatively, talking about things comparatively, it probably helps to illuminate things. And in some way, the comparisons obscure or cause relativism. So I don't know how to answer that.
So Mandisa, then Catherine.
Thanks, John. I'm just curious to know, given the historical account you have given, what is the relationship then between Turkey and Greece and Syria? Because it sounds really scary. So I just want to know now, what is the relationship between these countries?
I'm not an expert. I'm not an expert on today. I've studied a bit 1894, 1924. I don't really know much about current relations.
Okay, then, because I was going to say, it's curious to know that Turkey wanted to be part of the European Union as well. So,
one thing I will say, which will surprise you perhaps, and you won't necessarily like it, is that Turkey's destruction and expulsion of its Christian communities, the Turkification of Turkey, and the Greek eventual exchange or deportation of its own Muslims, most of the Muslims from Greece, left unitary national states, that is, monolithic national states. And since 1923, these two countries have not fought a war. Whereas before that, you've got a history of continuous warfare, rebellion, oppression, suppression, because the populations are mixed. Once you unmix the populations, it brings about peace. The only place where Turkey and Greece have fought since 1923 is in Cyprus, because the populations were still intermixed, and the Turks invade and whatever. But it's worth thinking about this.
Catherine.
I have a question about, you mentioned the bestseller about the Armenian genocide.
Which I know of, yeah.
Okay. Have you read Birds Without Wings by Louis de Bernières, which is also about this, and I wondered about the accuracy of it, because it depicts it from the perspective of a single village being purged over just the same...
I haven't read the book.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, so Rami, then Ramsey.
Prof, I have a quick question, because I like a short question. Why Turkey is still a matter for the Arab Muslim world until today?
Say that again?
Why Turkey is still a matter for the Arab Muslim countries until today? Why Turkey is important for these countries?
Well, Turkey is a major Muslim state, and the Arab states are fellow Muslim states. What's interesting in the subject of Turkish-Arab relations is the hostility in Turkey towards the Arab states. The Turks basically don't like Arabs, and they see the Arabs as betrayers. They see the Arabs in World War I. Some of them fought with Lawrence, and some of them, many of them left the army, ran away from the army when they were busy fighting the British and so on during World War I. So the Turks traditionally have seen the Arabs as Muslims who should have fought alongside them faithfully and energetically as betrayers of the Muslim Turkish cause in World War I. And this mars Turkish-Arab relations.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you mentioned that it's in Israel's national interest not to what to maintain good relations.
No, I said what dictates is how they see national interest.
Yeah.
It's not. I don't see it as. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Well, of course we know that Tayyip Erdogan has positioned himself as one of the leading antagonists of Israel, second maybe only to Iran. And a champion of Hamas. And so my question is, why has Israel retained this position? Are they distinguishing?
Well, I must.
Erdogan,
Okay.
Erdogan regime?
I must tell you. I ask exactly the same question you ask. I don't understand Netanyahu's behavior, certainly with Erdogan being so aggressively anti-Israeli. I wouldn't compare him to the Iran incident. He never said, until now, he certainly hasn't said, I'd like to destroy Israel, or Israel must be destroyed, as the Iranians daily say. Turkey hasn't said that, but it's obvious that Erdogan hates Israel. He's probably anti-Semitic. And I think Israel should be much more, forthright and just tell the guy to go to hell and Israel should cut off relations with Turkey. That's my feeling, but he doesn't do that. And Israel, of course, should announce that it supports the historical version of the Armenian genocide, what actually happened. And it hasn't done that, which I think is shameful, but that's my view. But I'm explaining why Israel hasn't done that. Netanyahu, for economic and some sort of strategic reasons, still sees Turkey as potentially some form of ally or at least a non-enemy, and therefore wants to keep them in play.
First of all, thank you very much for the excellent presentation. A couple of questions. You said that the Armenians were deported from elsewhere, from anywhere actually in Turkey. What about, I have never heard about the deportation from the Armenian quarter in Jerusalem.
Well, they were being deported in that direction, towards Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. In other words, if they lived far away, there was a very small Jewish Armenian community in Jerusalem, very, very small, minute, didn't interest them. And they didn't deport people from Jerusalem or from Aleppo, in fact, from the original Armenian community living in Aleppo. That didn't interest them because that was the direction in which they wanted to deport the Armenians. A bit more to the southeast, but also in that direction. What's more interesting is why didn't they deport the Armenian community from Istanbul, Constantinople in 1915-16, and why didn't they deport them in large numbers from Izmir? There were small deportations from Izmir as well, but essentially they left most of the Armenians in place in these two large coastal cities. And the question is why they didn't deport them from there, and nobody really knows the answer. We don't have Turkish documentation explaining everything, probably because there were a lot of Western eyes on these places. Izmir was full of Western diplomats, but essentially merchants, and Istanbul was full of 100,000 Westerners or something lived there. So it would have been too obvious what's happening. But it's interesting why they didn't actually carry out full-scale deportations from these two centers of Armenian, what you could even call power, economic power.
One last question. In late November 1914, the declaration was published on behalf of the Sultan as a head of the Fidels, declaring jihad on all the...
Well, by the Sheikhul Islam, the head of the Islamic Church.
On behalf of the Sultan. The question is, was this declaration understood by the clergy in Turkey itself as directed against the Ottoman Christians?
Okay, it's a good question. Okay.
Foreign Christian powers.
Okay, in November 1914, when Turkey enters the war, when the Ottomans join formally, officially, and with acts of hostility join the war on the German side, the head of the Muslim church or the Muslim clergy in the empire, the Sheikhul Islam, as he's called, issues a fatwa, a declaration of jihad, the fatwa of jihad. It specifically talks about the Christian powers. There's an irony there, of course, because the Turks are fighting alongside the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians, who are also Christian powers. But it's against the Russians, the French, and the British, the allies who are Christian powers. It doesn't mention specifically that fatwa, the internal Christian enemies, that is the Greeks, the Assyrians, and the Armenians. But most Turks who heard the thing understood it's now their fair game, that is the Christians inside the empire. It was implicit, but you're right, it wasn't made explicit in that fatwa. There's this distinction. Countries, not minorities.
So we have Giuseppe, then Rafi, and we're going to go a little bit over time.
It will be very, very quick. Thank you very much. But actually, my question is in the wake of the first one. Apart from the Sheikh al-Islam, did you find information about the role of Muslim religion in the massacres? And I ask this because in the Middle Ages, it happened often in Egypt that, let's say, pogroms against Copts were prompted by local religious leaders?
Yes, again an interesting question. We dealt with that a lot. That is, when we got the reports from the diplomats, the French consuls, the German consuls, the British consuls, the Americans, and so on, reporting about what's happening in each area, the Muslim clergy in each place and the seminarians, that is the students in the Islamic academies, are prominent often in the pogroms against the locals, the local Christians. In Istanbul as well, the big pogroms in 1895-6 also are in part led by muftis and seminarians, or policemen dressed as seminarians. There's a whole interesting question about that. But yes, usually, but you do also find here and there in the provinces, in Trabzon, for example, during 1516 and in 1921 or 2, you find muftis going to the local mutasari for the valley and pleading not to expel or destroy our neighbors, our Christian neighbors with whom we've lived for a long time in peace. So you do occasionally have interventions by Muslim dignitaries or clerics, but the more often, much more often, they're in the vanguard of the pogroms against Christians.
So Rafi, then Laura.
Many thank you very much for a very good presentation. I really enjoyed that. Two questions, clarification, if I may. One, you mentioned that some of your sources, all of your sources, come from diplomats at that time in Turkey. Is this the major source, or there are other sources? You can elaborate about the sources. And second, at the same time, there was also, I would say, I don't know how you're going to term it, clashes, exchanges, all kind of stuff going on between Turkey and Bulgaria. Did you study that? And can you say something about that?
Turkey, Bulgaria, I didn't look into. We also didn't look into the Caucasus, incidentally. Things in the Caucasus were very complex. Azeris, Georgians, Russians, Turks, it was beyond us, and also the languages are beyond our ken. We didn't look at the Caucasus, but we also didn't look at Bulgaria. It's sort of marginal. The Caucasus is not so marginal. Bulgaria is not really part of what happened in 1894-96 or 1915-16 or 1919-1923. The sources. My colleague, Dror Zeevi, looked thoroughly into what exists in Turkey, which is published volumes, lots of published volumes about the period by the Turkish state and the Prime Minister's archive. He wasn't given access, as most researchers have not been given access, to the military archive in Ankara. That's closed, and we understand that's closed to everybody. And he discovered through in various ways that the archives he saw and the documentation he saw was purged. In other words, they take out things which are incriminating. They do have documentation about deportations, but not about mass murder accompanying the deportations or as part of the deportations. They do allow some documentation of the actual deportations, the deportation orders. Sometimes they're even covered by treat nicely the deportees, whereas we know that alongside that order there was another order, try and get rid of as many deportees as you can. So the Turks knew they were doing something criminal throughout certainly 1914, 1918, and they try to cover it with softer documentation. The main documentation about what happened in Turkey, and the most reliable documentation, this report. They won't complete lie about what they've been seeing or what they've been told. The question is, who feeds information to the consuls? That is, sometimes they see things, but often they're fed information by local Armenian priests or local Greek priests, but they're also fed information by the local Turkish vali or the local Turkish governor, the mutasari, from whatever. So they receive information from all channels: the Germans, the French, the British, the Americans, and one other major source of documentation is the missionaries. The place is covered with missionaries, as I say, mostly American, some Germans, Swedes, Danes, British, French, etc. And they provide also a lot of information. Again, you will say they have sympathy for the Christians who are being persecuted, but again, they're sort of enjoined by their faith, by their upbringing and so on, and also they're not reporting publicly. It's not for propaganda. They're sending it up the line of the chain of command of their organizations. So they're trying to report what they see and what they hear. And so it's also basically believable. And the missionaries provide enormous amounts of documentation.
Laura, and then I'm going to collect a few questions. We'll wrap up.
Something I've always been curious about is that the Greek Orthodox Church Center is still in Istanbul, and why, during the exchange of 24, 26, that it was allowed to remain in Istanbul.
That was part of the deal. That there would be the Greeks in Istanbul would be allowed to remain, and basically they were ejected and end in pogroms in the 1950s. There were a number of pogroms against Greeks in the 1950s, and that's why there's no Greeks, essentially no Greeks left in Istanbul, whereas there were Greeks between 24 and the 1950s. The Armenians also have an enormous center in Istanbul as well. So that wasn't ejected either. And as I say, Istanbul was sort of left out of what was happening, partly because it was under Western gaze. They had to be much more careful, or that's how they felt. They have to be more careful about what's happening in Istanbul.
Okay. Barry, and then Aaron, very, very quickly. Quick questions.
Okay. The
really quick.
Western reaction to the Armenian massacres. You say the Germans and the Austrians were involved in the Turkish side. Apart from Hitler in Mein Kampf, whoever gave the was anybody else giving publicity? Was he reacting to publicity about the Armenian massacre, or was he? I mean,
I don't know. I don't remember that he mentions the Armenians in Mein Kampf. There's a famous sentence by Hitler during the beginning of World War II, when he's about to kill people in the East, including Jews, but doesn't refer to Jews actually. He says, "Who remembers the Armenian massacres?" That's a famous sentence. But more to the point, the German consuls and ambassador in Istanbul were of two minds. It's ambivalent, their reaction to what is happening. On the one hand, it's our ally who's doing it. On the other hand, this ally doesn't want us interfering, and we can't really interfere in what's happening, even if we don't like what they're doing to the Armenians. And there were some German officers who were complicit in what was happening. But the German consuls, including incidentally one who later dies in the Munich Putsch, standing next to Hitler, he's an early Nazi, Richter I think was his name, he reports massacres where he is. I don't remember if it's Trabzon or one of the other towns. So the German consuls were basically reporting fairly.
The German army on the eastern front in places like Kiev actually protected the Jews in 1917-18.
Yeah, that's a different story. I'm talking about the Armenians in Turkey.
Why was there a disinterest in Armenian Christians and protecting Jews in Ukraine? It doesn't.
I can't answer that.
So, okay, very quickly, I'm going to collect two questions before you respond. Aaron, very briefly, and then Catherine, very briefly, then we'll wrap it up.
Are there estimates on the value of property lost, destroyed, looted, destroyed, confiscated?
I don't know. I mean, I think there's work being done on it recently about how much property was looted or confiscated. There has been work done by a Turkish, I can't remember his name, but a Turkish scholar, but I don't know the figures.
Catherine?
Any suggestion of a papal response to this event?
I haven't checked. I don't know.
Okay. So, on behalf of the group, thank you for... Many thank you. And so, that's it for today. Hold on. Yeah, hang on.